Hi. So we're continuing on with Palace Wagon Family, the true story of the Donner Party. Remember, we left off, and the Reed family, was on the salt flats, and they had all of their dogs climb on top of them to keep them warm because it's very cold on the salt flats at night. Sorry, my camera arm is kind of in the way. All right. Did you want to say goodnight to everyone during their bedtime story? I know you do because you're making sounds that you want to say goodnight. So Percy wants to say goodnight. Here comes Winston. All right. They were very excited about Bring Your Pet to Zoom Day, huh? You were very excited. Yes, you were, to bring your pet to Zoom. I just ate some salmon for lunch / dinner, so so I am being attacked because there's nothing these guys like better than salmon. Yeah, you loved a salmon. Okay, okay, okay. I know. I would love to start reading sometime. Yes, we would love to start reading once we're done being attacked. Yes. Oh, now they're licking each other. They actually had some salmon too. I gave them some earlier. Okay. Can I read the bedtime story, please? Yes? Yes? Can I please read? Oh, good heavens. Good heavens. Ah! 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 I'm being attacked by dogs. God. I'm just kidding. Go, go, go. Everyone go. Okay. So we left them in the middle of the salt flats covered in dogs, ironically enough. I have to keep up. Dear God, I have to keep up, she kept telling herself as she stumbled on. Mile after mile she walked in the darkness, each step seeming to be the very last she could take. Patty soon began to fall down from weariness and thirst. Jimmy stumbled, fell, and would not get up. Bless him, he's sound asleep, Mrs. Reed whispered, bending over him. A shawl was spread on the sand. Here it was almost pure salt, as white as snow. Mr. Reed placed Tommy, already asleep, beside Jimmy on the shawl. Virginia and Patty cuddled close to them, trying to keep warm. A bitter wind was blowing across the desert. I'm cold, cold, Patty began to whimper. Another shawl was spread over the shivering children. Finally, Mr. Reed called all 5 dogs, Barney, Tyler, Tryler, Tracker, and Little Cash. None had gone ahead with the men who were driving the cattle to water. They might as well be of some use. He commanded them to lie down on top of the children. For a little while the whole family slept there on the desert, with the chill wind blowing salt and sand over the strange mound of huddled up people and dogs. Then suddenly the dogs began to bark. There was a rushing sound through the darkness, and all started up from the heap, throwing all the shawls aside. Some animal was charging directly towards them, its horns lowered. It's one of my steers. It must have gone mad, the children's father shouted, not meaning to frighten them. The maid Eliza screamed. Terrified, Patty ran in one direction and Jimmy in the other. Mr. Reed was holding Tommy. Finally, he corralled the rest of the family and ordered them to stay behind him. He drew his pistol, ready to shoot the thirst-crazed animal if it should charge towards them again. Instead, it ran off, pursued by the yapping dogs. Virginia was now wide awake and was as terrified as the little children. Pa, she croaked, but found out that her throat was so dry she could scarcely speak. A little of the precious water her father had brought back from the distant spring was given to her, but it was almost gone. There could be no more stopping now, no matter how tired or cold or thirsty they became. As if in a bad dream, All of the reeds kept on moving, step after step, until a white-covered wagon loomed ahead. It turned out to be the wagon of Jacob Donner and his wife Elizabeth. Mr. Reed had expected to find it there. He had passed it on his way in from the spring. The oxen had been unhitched and driven ahead for water. "They'll be back soon, but we've got bad news for you, Reed," Mr. Donner told him. "Your cattle scented water, and off they went." Milt Elliott's horse had fallen down from thirst. The men were trying to get him up when it happened. "I'll lend you a horse of mine if you want to ride ahead and see if you can find them. We'll take your family in." "Thanks, Jake." Mr. Reed set off immediately on the borrowed horse to find out what had become of the cattle. Virginia watched him ride away and then went inside the wagon. The Donner children were sound asleep. were so sound asleep that it was daylight before they knew that the Reed family had come. "What happened?" Mary Donner asked, waking up when the wagon started. She was surprised to find Patty beside her, worn out after the night of walking, but still holding her dolly in her arms. Jim and little Tommy were huddled together, their arms about each other as they slept. Young George Donner looked at them and grinned. "That's the Reeds for you, always hugging something. How come you're riding with us instead of your own wagons? Didn't your oxen get back from the spring?" Virginia shook her head. She took another sip of the fresh spring water the Donners had given her, but still her throat felt dry. "What about your wagons?" "We had to leave them," she managed to say. "You'll go back for them then, won't you?" asked Mary. "I don't know." All at once, Virginia realized that there was a great deal she didn't know. How could they go back with no oxen? How could they get along at all if her father and the teamsters didn't find them? So think for a second. This is one of the things I always think about. So if you were traveling and you were walking across a desert made of salt, it seems to me like you wouldn't want to have a big, huge wagon, that it would be easier to travel a little bit lighter with less of your belongings. In the video that I posted of the hikers that were just on foot, they had a truck that would come and bring them water, but it seems like you would want to be traveling a lot lighter, and that having a wagon would make travel a little bit more cumbersome and difficult for you, right? So it's kind of interesting, especially that big, huge palace wagon. That thing couldn't even move without oxen to pull it, and so they're going to find that they don't have their oxen anymore, so they're not going to be able to use that wagon. "Please, God, help them," she prayed silently. She tried to tell the Donner children of the terrible night they had spent on the desert. Her prayers had helped her then. Strengthened by silently asking God's help, she had been able to keep on putting one foot in front of the other for 10 long miles in the cold and wind. Sometimes the sand blowing against her face had felt like pieces of glass, but now the nightmare was over. Virginia found it hard to talk about it. "We walked and walked. Papa saw your wagon when he was coming back to us with water. We knew we had to catch up to you. But when we got here, you were all asleep, so we had to lie down on the ground with the dogs on top of us to keep us warm. Why didn't you come in?" "I don't know," Virginia replied. She had been so numb with cold that she did not realize that the family slept on the sand long before they came to the Donner wagons. They had left their own great palace car standing like a monument on the desert with the mirror still unbroken. So it's my understanding that the salt flats have mud, a layer of mud underneath, and that things that are on the salt sink into the ground. And so it would be interesting. I'm sure that their palace wagons sunk into the ground, but it would be interesting to dig it up and see what it looked like after years and years, and do like an archaeological dig on it. Will the Indians find it and look at themselves and laugh? The children wondered. There were a few wandering Indians on the desert. Smoke from their campfires had been seen on the distant hills, most of which were gray volcanic heaps of ash. But Pilot Peak, their guide across the desert, had a cap of snow. So there were Indians that lived in western Utah and that also lived in eastern, I guess you'd call it eastern Nevada. The tribe that lived there was the Paiute tribe. And especially in Nevada, the Paiute lived in Nevada. They wandered a lot because it was really hard to find food in Nevada. If you've ever driven across the deserts of Nevada, you know that. It would probably be easier to find food if you were up near Reno, up near the mountains. There would probably be more animals. But down as you get in the flatlands of Nevada, it's very flat desert. And so the Paiute generally, you hear Percy crying, the Paiute generally traveled a lot. They moved around a lot. They weren't like the California tribes that settled in one place. So they probably were not going to see any Indians because, what? You want to come sit on my lap? Did he take your dog bed? And that's why you're crying? Sorry, we're having a little conflict. Okay, well, why don't you come up here and I will, or you can take the dog bed and you come up here. Either way, you're making it really hard for me to read. Yes. Okay, come up here. Come on. Come on. Give him the dog bed and you come up here. You guys can't see what's happening off camera. There's a whole bunch of crying. Okay, come on up. Come on up. Jump. Jump, jump. Jump. Okay, there we go. Now you have that dog bed all to yourself. He's going to cry because he's not sitting in my lap. So there were probably Paiute tribe members that were around and about, but they did not stay in one place for very long because it was really hard to find food in the desert. So they kind of roamed around looking for food constantly. That was their life. They didn't have time to make baskets or do a whole lot of other things because they were looking for food and water pretty much all the time. Will the Indians find it and look at themselves and laugh, the children wondered. There were a few wandering Indians on the desert. Smoke from their campfires had been seen on the distant hills, most of which were gray, volcanic heaps of ash. But Pilot Peak, their guide across the desert, had a cap of snow. The snow-capped peak loomed larger and larger until the Reed children, riding in the wagon with the Donners, could see the green below it. That's where the spring is, young George announced. Pa said so. He got our water from there, Mary added. From then on, the children talked of nothing but water. They ran toward it as soon as the wagon stopped. They lay down in the cool green mint leaves and lapped the water with their tongues like kittens. They sprayed it all over each other, making a game of it. I'll splash you, Patty. Watch out, Mary. Go ahead. The little girls laughed back at the boys. The water feels good on our heads. Here's mud, cried Jimmy, dipping his hands into it up to the elbows. Come on, Tommy, let's play in the mud. Virginia looked at her mother. Go ahead, children, play in it. Roll in it if you want to, she told them. There's your papa come to meet us. We'll all play in the mud. We'll bathe ourselves all over afterwards and get the sand out of your eyes and out of our hair. Mrs. Reed stopped. Her husband put his arm around her and said with tears in his eyes, I never meant to lead you into anything like this, Margaret. It's all right, James, she answered, her head against him. I know. We'll get along some way. Just how they would get along nobody knew. Only one ox and one cow had been found out of their herd of more than 100 cattle. It was feared that the rest had been stolen by the Indians. I doubt that they were stolen by the Indians. I think most of them ran off because they were dying of thirst, right? I mean, cows have to drink and oxen have to drink. And so if there's no water and you're forcing them to walk mile after mile, they're going to leave and go look for water. We'll find them yet, the other emigrants were saying. They were all at the spring now. Some had been there for 2 days and were ready to push ahead. But without Reed's cattle, everybody would be short of food, and so it was decided that the women and children would rest in camp while the men went back to the desert and searched. So again, this is a waste of time. They are wasting more time, and it's going to start snowing in the Sierra Nevada mountains, and they are going to get stuck there. And if they would have hurried up and hustled through, they might have made it. Every man in the Donner Party joined in the desperate hunt for the lost cattle. Nobody liked the delay. It was already the middle of September, and it was still a long way to Sutter's Fort, the goal of every emigrant who started for California in 1846. A week was spent there on the edge of the desert in fruitless search, so they blew a whole week waiting. Granted, they were probably resting up and getting lots of water ready. The Reeds knew that their wagons must be abandoned. Good uncles to everybody, Billy Graves and Patrick Breen, each lent them an ox. Just as Virginia had feared, they could only bring one wagon out of the desert. It was not the great palace wagon, but a smaller one that had been stored with provisions. Their home on wheels was left to be blown to pieces by the salt and sand. And we will end right there. Someone is falling asleep with this bedtime story. Yeah. All right. I will see you tomorrow night for the next round of your bedtime story. Thanks for joining me.